So very quickly, one idea: poetry, science, place. I'm just really enjoying my time at York as a scientist, but within the Humanities Research Centre, looking at the science humanities stuff. And this is a project, part of which Kevin Killeen and I've been talking about, which is to do with early modern place and poetry and science and the forgotten connection between the two, but it's local connectivity. A few events engaging with the York Festival of Ideas on events such as this one, Science Imagination, the Big Questions, this year has convinced me that there's a resurgence of poetry and place and science connections as well. So the hypothesis is that Goethe was right. Famously said that, first of all, that science and poetry deeply belong together, share the nursery, but that they've parted ways, and everyone's even forgotten that they were cousins or sisters and brothers. So what does that mean? It means that people like Robert Hunt in the 19th century, which is where certainly the two cultures division came to the fore. Lens's laboratories, alkalis, have no place in the painted bower of the muses. Or, of course, I know everyone here knows Allan Poe's view on science, thou vulture, whose wings are dull realities. Well, is it necessarily so? Been reading at the moment Claire Preston's fantastic book on the poetics of scientific investigation. And I should say all this came also out of the work I did for this creativity book that Richard mentioned, which had a chapter on fiction in early modern century, the origin of fiction and the contemporary origin of experimental science. But since then, I've realized there's a whole other story to tell about poetry, which connects with place and time now. Poetry becomes sort of metaphor for these early modern dualisms. Read Mary Mitchley's book, Science and Poetry, which isn't about poetry, it's about the two cultures, and it's about why Dawkins is wrong. And something is happening now. Sam Illingworth at Manchester University has founded in the North a new online, free-to-access journal of science and poetry. It's called Consilience, and it's worth a look. All sorts of writing about poetry and science, including anthologies by scientists who also write fantastic poetry, like much lamented Rebecca Elson, and a poet of the North, Katrina Porteous, who I want to work with, who's written fabulous poetry, who joined us in the festival last year. But I think the hypothesis is to connect poetry, place, and science together. We have to go back to the place and time before they parted. Margaret Cavendish, Duchess of Newcastle, writing conceptually imaginative poetry about atoms, Lucretian atoms, in 1653. Elizabeth Tollet, Staffordshire, knew Newton very well, wrote extraordinarily powerfully about the constriction on women in the 17th century, since, on her extraordinary mind, imaginative, mathematical, scientific work. Here she is conceptualizing in poetry a non-temporal concept of time. Who time this is God who does to man successive flow, collects and centers in eternal now, for infinite duration gains no more, no perfect, loses what it had before. Quite extraordinary thinking, which I want to unearth. Daniel Hull, Andrew Marvell, of course, writes extraordinarily presciently, inveighs against the Anthropocene in his Moa Against Gardens. So there's the human destruction or fancification of the natural world, to take this both ways. So there are a few themes I want to dig up. And Chris Bailey, who I think has now left us, I want to be in touch with, because this idea of the poet writing an encounter with place. There are thoughts that scientists need to think or conceive and have done in the past that are essentially poetic, or in other words, theoria and poesis are linked, and that all has to do with a public sharing of taking science out of its box, possessing it culturally, enjoying it, and connecting it with place. anyone here interested in helping me or talking with me with this as a companion in conversation, I'd be more than happy to meet. Thank you so much.